Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at what can be done to help prevent war and armed conflict. My guest today is someone who's been involved with this issue for many years. My guest today is Dr. Bob Zuber, and Dr. Robert Zuber is the director of the Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict NGO. Bob Zuber, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill, very much.
I appreciate you being with me, Bob. Let's start right off at the beginning. What is your NGO, Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict? When was it started? Why was it started?
Started in 1999 by three individuals, Saul Mendlowitz, Ambassador Jonathan Dean, and Randall Forsberg, who was quite a significant figure. And what they were trying to do was to create a document that linked a variety of security concerns and tools that were not yet in the international community toolbox, but needed to be. It was an interesting project. It had two limitations at the time, one of which was it probably wasn't generous enough with the many organizations around the world that were actually doing some of this tool work. And secondly, Global Action wasn't doing that much about it itself. It was a repository for ideas, but it wasn't actually active. And so what we did in 2004 was to turn the project around a little bit, stay with war prevention, conflict resolution, but to invest more in the UN and invest more in specific parts of the UN system that we thought had promise. Disarmament was our legacy project, but also women, peace and security, protection of civilians, and UN media, which we've discussed in the past. And we've developed a rather robust social media presence, Twitter and blog and such. We have a number of wonderful interns from all over the world, and we set them loose in the UN to learn about the full system, not simply the issues that we're known for.
And our viewers can go to your website, globalactionpw.org, and learn much more about what we're talking about. Well, let's talk about the first, well, I think it was the second item you mentioned, civilian protection. What are some of the observations you've made in that area, and what can be done to help provide more protection for civilians?
Well, as I think you know, peacekeeping operations was slow to embrace protection of civilians within its mandates, but now protection of civilians is very commonly associated with peacekeeping mandates, the more robust and the less robust ones. And obviously we think this is a very important consideration, very important move. And it's associated a little bit with the responsibility to protect norm, which you know. R2P focuses primarily, well, exclusively on atrocity crimes and the prevention and response to atrocity crimes. Protection of civilians has a bit broader mandate. And we think it's important that peacekeeping operations learn more effectively how to protect civilians and what situations to protect them. And the UN can help in part by explaining to people what a protection of civilians mandate is. We don't protect all civilians. We protect some civilians in some contexts under some circumstances. And so making sure that we don't raise the bar higher than we have the capacity to respond, but that we respond in every circumstance where response is warranted.
And that is a very tricky situation. It's very difficult to do. And it's so often we say, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we do X, Y, and Z? But it's quite different when you're in a war zone or you have people shooting at each other. Another area that's of great importance and doesn't get much publicity, unfortunately, is disarmament.
Oh, absolutely.
And we saw just recently, about a week ago, I guess, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution overwhelmingly to ban nuclear weapons. What was the outgrowth of that particular resolution? What was it about? And who voted against it? Who voted? Not all the countries, but in general, who voted for it?
Well, it was Resolution L41. There was a coalition of NGOs. We were tangentially related to that coalition, but they did fantastic work in terms of campaigning for this resolution. It doesn't ban nuclear weapons per se. It establishes a negotiating mechanism for a treaty, more likely a resolution on steroids or a declarative treaty, that would set out the parameters for eventually eliminating the possession, use, development of nuclear weapons. So it's a ban treaty in short, but it basically establishes a process that would lead to an outcome that many of us think is long overdue. In terms of who's voted for it and against it, somewhat predictably, the nuclear weapons possessing states were not very fond of the idea of taking something out of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty process. And they were able to influence some of their closest allies to either abstain from the resolution or vote against it, and that's likely to continue. There's likely to be pressure on the ban treaty negotiation process in perpetuity, because there are states that do not appreciate, I think they're wrong, but there are some nuclear weapon states that don't appreciate this kind of shrinking of space, that there are more and more parts of the world that have rejected nuclear weapons, that have rejected nuclear weapons doctrines, that have rejected nuclear weapons protections, and I think that that's a very important development.
Now, as I recall, the U.S., the U.K., France, and Russia voted against it. China abstained. There are still 4 more nuclear weapon states. What are those other 4, and why did those first 4 vote against it?
Well, India and Pakistan abstained, if I recall this correctly. The DPRK, oddly enough, voted for it, which I'm not entirely sure what that's about.
People's Republic
of Korea,
North
yes,
Korea.
right, North Korea.
Okay.
And Israel voted against as well. So, I think the reasoning has to do with, in the case of some nuclear weapon states, not wanting the General Assembly to be meddling in their security policy. I think some of it has to do with governments assuming that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty process from 1995 is the way to go about effecting disarmament under Article 6, which requires good faith negotiations towards its nuclear disarmament. So I think that there are some legitimate reasons for at least questioning the resolution. I'm not sure there was sufficient rationale for rejecting the resolution altogether. And I think, the NPT's been in existence a long time. There's been very limited movement on the disarmament obligation. There's been some good work on the non-proliferation obligation. But it's not unreasonable for states, and of course NGOs were an impatient lot, but for states to decide that that something else in addition to what we have needs to be applied to this concern.
And the NPT, it was really raised as one of the, hopefully, a harbinger of great news as to how we could start to disarm, to reduce the nuclear weapons. There have been, over the years, as I recall, and I may be off on this number, but at least 12 documented incidents where there could have been a nuclear exchange, where someone in the old Soviet Union or in Russia or in the United States, some person was just about to give the order to push the button. We saw the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We were on red alert. The next step was to push the button, which would have been, we wouldn't be here today if that had happened. But how much of a risk do we run to have some type of a nuclear accident, to have some computer go haywire? We look at the equipment that's with the nuclear system out in the Midwest in the United States. It's antiquated.
Right.
It goes back to the 50s and 60s. But we're sitting on a time bomb. We could have some type of accident that would cause Russia to send one our way, or we send one their way, or whatever. And then we're talking about really the annihilation of the planet.
Yeah, William Perry, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, has written a book, and he's been going around the country talking about the increased risks of a nuclear attack. He did a presentation in New York, I think 2 weeks ago, that my colleague John Burroughs helped to sponsor. His sense is that that there are technological problems within the nuclear apparatus that might cause problems for us, but also the threat of terrorism and the migrations of people caused by climate change, caused by armed violence locally, drought, in food insecurity, and so all of these triggers of violence could result, theoretically, in somebody getting a hold of something along the lines of a nuclear weapon and discharging it and setting off a larger, wider conflict, yes.
And speaking of someone getting a nuclear weapon, there is a glimmer of hope, a ray of hope, if you will. About a year ago, as August 2015, there was a deal, the Iran agreement was agreed to, primarily by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the EU and a few other groups, the UN, obviously actively involved in this. What is the significance of that And it appears to be a treaty that's holding, and it is actually reducing the nuclear stockpile in Iran, is it not?
Yeah, well, Iran didn't have a nuclear stockpile. What they had is yes, they had sort of protocols that could have at some point led to the production of a nuclear weapon. Yeah, I think I was surprised at the time. I remember being in the Security Council when they endorsed the treaty process, and there was quite a bit of hostile response from some quarters in the U.S., not only in the U.S. I think the council members were right. This was and Germany as well. This was a victory for multilateralism. This is the kind of engagement that's possible when Security Council members get over themselves and watch each other's back and put their energy where it needs to be put. The IAEA is totally convinced that this agreement is holding. Hopefully, will continue to hold. There's been some issues about the release of sanctions and making sure that Iran is able to trade appropriately, et cetera, because they agreed to this thing. And there are many people who have visceral distrust of Iran, and I'm trained as a counselor. I know that if you don't trust someone, they can do something decent for the right reason, and you can still distrust them because you have this legacy of distrust that you're kind of walking around with. But I think in this particular case, Iran negotiated hard. They were their own negotiators. They had lots of countries in their face about this, and I would be very surprised if this agreement doesn't hold for a considerable period of time.
And it's to everyone's interest that it does hold, because
gosh,
as I recall, they were saying at the time, if this deal fell apart a little over a year ago, that what probably would happen within 6 months to a year is there would be some type of war. And there's no really military expert out there who believes that you're going to be able to stop a nuclear program by starting another war.
No,
it just is not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen.
So it really is one that needs to hold. And also we've seen that there's so much misinformation, especially in the United States. I'm not sure about overseas, but people have been commenting on how we sent $150 billion to the Iranians as a gift. First off, they didn't get $150 billion; they only got $54 billion.
Right.
Secondly, it was their money that was frozen. It was not
correct.
from the U.S. Treasury.
But
there is a lot of misinformation that's flying around this country and maybe in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to view some of the previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus network, or if you have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. You can go to the website, download them free of charge at no cost. It's really a public service that's provided to help us better understand international issues and how they impact us. Today we're taking a look at how we can reduce conflict, armed conflict, and really the buildup of nuclear weapons. And my guest today is an expert on this. My guest today is Dr. Robert Zuber, and Dr. Bob Zuber is the Director of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. Bob, before we get off the nuclear weapons, because this is really an issue that it just looms over all of us. It's like the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads.
One of them, for sure.
One of the many, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And we don't always hear about it. But another area we talked about years ago was to have free weapons of mass destruction free zones. What is the status of that? We were talking years ago about doing the Middle East, various areas of the world. Has there been any movement in that area to have areas designated where countries cannot have weapons of mass destruction?
Yes, thankfully. There are a number of nuclear weapon-free zones around the world. Some of them overlap. Some of them, like Tlatelolco in Latin America, have a very robust secretariat and do some very, very interesting work with foreign ministries on a whole range of conflict prevention measures. Others are less robust in their secretariat functions, but much of the world now is characterized by these zones. The Middle East is not. The decision to convene conferences that would that would work towards a nuclear weapon-free zone were agreed to in the NPT process. So it was actually a promise that was made that this be done, a promise within the NPT structure. And the fact that it hasn't been done is enormously frustrating. It's caused lots of political problems, and unfortunately, it's tied to a larger problem at the UN, which is that when we pass resolutions or adopt treaties, have treaty body discussions, etc., we don't understand, I think, enough that we are conveying promises to the global public. They have expectations of us. And when those expectations are dashed, when they are reassessed without the public's knowledge, when people are not getting what they thought that they were entitled to from the United Nations, it does great damage to our credibility as an organization, as an institution. And I think the Middle East zone is one of those swords of Damocles that isn't threatening to destroy us directly, but it's threatening to undermine the credibility of the NPT, which has repercussions for nuclear weapons possession. So I think it's a very unfortunate gap in our promise keeping.
Mm-hmm. Now, the International Court of Justice, commonly called the World Court, is located in The Hague. It's one of 6 of the UN organs, a major organ, without a doubt. Did the Marshall Islands recently have a case before the World Court?
Yes.
That tied into our discussion?
Yeah, they did. The Marshall Islands, along with a legal team, which included Iolana, which is an office mate of ours, they filed a suit at the ICJ looking for an opinion on behalf of the Marshall Islands, a country, as you know, that suffered greatly from nuclear testing when nuclear testing was done above ground. And what they were asking for, based on a previous ICJ advisory opinion, was to cite the nuclear weapons states for their failure to negotiate in good faith on their nuclear disarmament obligations. And so what the Marshall Islands did, I thought, was very smart, which is they went before the court and they said, we have a legacy of damage from these weapons. We are not here to seek reparations. We are not here to seek punitive damages. We don't want money. What we want is a judgment to get the nuclear weapons states to fulfill their good faith obligations on disarmament. I thought it was very cleverly done. The team did a great job. The court, unfortunately, was divided, and thus we didn't win the case. But I think some political space was opened up that I think will be very useful down the line, because there are multiple lenses to address the nuclear weapons problem. It's a moral issue. It's a humanitarian issue, it's a legal issue, it's a political issue, and I think we need to be, as we do with other UN issues, we need to be working on all the tracks.
Mm-hmm. And in any type of setting, whether it's war, armed conflict, whatever, 2 of the most vulnerable populations are women and children. They are really the ones who suffer the brunt of most of this, more so than the people who are in military uniforms, unfortunately.
It's true now.
What is the UN doing through either the Sustainable Development Goals, the Development Agenda for 2030? There's a whole myriad of activities underway, but are there certain things that are taking place that offer us a little bit of hope as far as helping women or to empower women, not only in armed conflict areas, but also just to be a more, let's say, reach their full potential as a member of society, and to do so in a safe environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know about Security Council Resolution 1325, which is really about, it's about the role of women in peace operations, so peacekeeping, mediation, conflict prevention, conflict resolution. It's an important resolution. It opened up some political space. It hasn't been fulfilled in quite the way we thought it would, but that's true of many things at the UN, obviously. It's true in my own life as well, unfortunately. But I think that the space that's been opened up has been valuable in other contexts. So, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's not only a goal on women's empowerment and women's issues, but the gender agenda permeates all the other goals as well. So it's cross-cutting. So there's no place in the UN system where women, their participation, their involvement is not on the agenda in some very significant way. We're still hopeful that there's still a Deputy Secretary General to be chosen, where we think that there are a spate of absolutely tremendously qualified women who should be considered for that post. We think they should be more than considered. We think one should be chosen. But there's not only kind of the gender dimensions that affect UN policy, but it's also the collateral effect. How does this affect women in other places? And some of the projects that we work with in the Global South, so-called, for instance, have done incredible work on getting women involved in areas and making decisions in areas where that was not the case in previous years. So I think the movement is positive. It's in the right direction. We have a lot of political work to do. We have some soul searching to do probably as well. But we're very optimistic. And children is a non-negotiable for most of the delegations of the UN. If you want to get a crowd at the UN, make it a children's event. Make it about youth and children, right. and the delegates will flock to it because they understand viscerally, and more than that, just how many children are affected by armed conflict, and also as they were talking about yesterday in the third committee, the trauma that is inflicted by these protracted conflicts on the emotional development of children, and these are going to be the adults. You know, you and I will be gone. They'll still be here. We've had our turn. It's their turn, and we need to make sure that they have the psychological tools as well as the technological tools to make a difference in the world. It's going to be tough for them.
Now, the United Nations is the only intergovernmental institution of its type in the world. It brings in all 193 countries of the world. They have representatives of every language, every religion, every economic system. It doesn't matter. They're all under one roof. And they deal with these problems that we're talking about, war and peace. We're talking about economic and social development, talking about peacekeeping, talking about moving aircraft safely in international airspace, moving ships on the high seas, just on across the board. But really, a large part of the UN, in fact, probably 99.9% of it, the UN is the institution, but the success or failure of some of the programs really rests on the shoulders of the individual member states, the 193 members, does it not?
No, absolutely. And you know, we have a lot of interns from different parts of the world, and they come into the UN and they're very excited, and then after a week or two, they're like very frustrated, and so you have to go back in and you have to stay with it and pay attention and learn what you can learn. I used to pastor a church in well, a couple, but one in Harlem, and back in the bad old days of crack, and you know, go to school board meetings and the acrimony and the hostility and the frustration of mothers wanting the best for their children. And these are people who, I mean, there was ethnic diversity, but these people shared more or less the same social context. And you have a place like the UN where people come from all over the world. They're solving the largest problems that exist anywhere in the world. They don't share a language, they don't share a culture, they often have histories of colonialism and racism and God knows whatever else. And that they manage to do as much as they do, I think is just absolutely miraculous. It's really quite stunning. And so part of our job, and part of the job I hope of other NGOs as well, is to help to balance the playing field here, because there are power imbalances. There are countries that matter a lot more than other countries. And so helping the smaller states to stay abreast of UN developments that they can't cover because they don't have enough people in the mission, helping them to take leadership over issues that are important to them and where they have some special competency. This is a way of not only balancing the system, but getting more capacity in the system to do the kinds of things that people expect the UN to do.
And there are many foreign policy observers, many historians, many people who know what's going on in the world who really believe firmly that if the UN did not exist today, first off, we'd have to create it tomorrow. And secondly, if it were not here, think back to 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would probably have been into World War III. And as Dr. Albert Einstein said, I believe something along these lines, that he didn't know, he wasn't sure about if we fought World War III what would happen, but he knew if we fought World War IV, it would be with sticks and stones because the world would be destroyed. But Dr. it's a tough situation. I know.
No, it's a tough situation.
It is, but Dr. Bob Zuber, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
Bill, it's great to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks so much.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.